You are listening to 99.1 WQRT LP Indianapolis, and this is Create Here. Produced by artists and curators from Big Car Collaborative, Create Here is your place to listen to conversations with people making intriguing, innovative, and impactful things happen on the cultural front in Indianapolis, Indiana, and beyond. Find out more and access additional episodes at WQRT.org.
Hello, welcome to another episode of Create Here. Today I'm joined by Rachel Leah Cohn. We're going to talk about her exhibit MIM, which just opened at Tube Factory Art Space and will run through June 23rd. Rachel's work is concerned with themes of communication, mythology, and rituals. Projects often attempt to give a physical form to something that is ephemeral through painting, sculpture, and installation. Recently, she lived in the desert, where she was building lamps simulating mirages as analog for memory and loss. Lately, her research has been focused on Jewish mysticism and protective magic. Rachel exhibits her work nationally and internationally, including Acre Gallery, Satellite Art Fair, Terrain Biennial, Massey University, Qatar Museums, and more. She has attended many artist residency programs, including Vermont Studio Center, Signal Culture, Otis College of Art and Design, and the Fire Station. She holds a BFA in painting from Rhode Island School of Design and an MFA in painting from Virginia Commonwealth University, and is currently the Foundation's coordinator and assistant professor of art for the School of Art at Ball State University in Muncie. Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you.
So it's been a lot of fun to work with you. This is I think the longest I've worked on a project with an artist, courtesy of the pandemic. What, we're on 5 years?
Yeah, I think we met about 5 years ago. Sorry. Yeah. We met about 5 years ago.
And let's start at the beginning. What was your work focused on when you moved to Indiana initially?
Well, so I had just come from Doha, where I was making these really large projects, sometimes out in the desert, also traveling a lot internationally. So I was making projects in different locations. I had started making a lot of work with this kind of translucent painting that's still within this project. But right when I came, that was a really transitional moment for me too. And then, only a few months later was the pandemic. So I think that was that whole period. Even those few years was really a very transitional moment.
Yeah, and the works that the radio paintings, I loved those. Can you talk about that project and what that was and entailed?
Yeah, so while I was living in Doha, I had a student who had brought these postcards to class that were the postcards that you get when you have a connection on the radio. And that was the first time I'd seen that. So I got really interested in that, and I ended up getting an amateur radio license. And so at that time, I was kind of working in Qatar. I was kind of learning about that activity. But when I came back, I had this invitation to do a project in New Zealand. And it was during the pandemic, so there was a big question of how we're going to get work to New Zealand. And I thought about these SSTV, the way that you send images over the radio. And I thought, okay, could I try to send a painting to New Zealand for this exhibition? And there's a lot of reasons why that doesn't work, but I also like that kind of attempt where you're throwing it out there and you're still, I had the painting, you encode it and then you send it out. So you don't really know who can hear it. So it could be, 1,000 people, it could be 0 people that get it. And then they can all kind of download this and see it, which I also like, the sort of access to these images. And in the end, with this exhibition, I worked with this sound artist, Charlotte Parallel, and we were kind of sending back and forth images, and then creating these kind of loops. So sending them up into the atmosphere of New Zealand and then collecting them back down and kind of looking at how the atmosphere affected the images.
And then can you describe a bit, now I know it probably varied, but when you would download them and print them out, what were they looking like?
There were different kinds of static that can happen. Some of it is like from, the atmosphere is also just like user error was like a big problem for me. I didn't know how to do it that well. So it kind of comes line by line. That's how SSTV works. So it's the same way that you would send, or that they did send images of the moon back to Earth. Mm-hmm. So it's like it does it encodes it line by line. So as you're listening, it sounds like a modem, and it's like kind of drawing it. And you can start to hear the different tones, like the different color, like is it a bright color or is it like a lot of black? And it would kind of interrupt the image. So it had these kind of gaps or different kind of like displaced images. So like some of them were like there was like an image of like fire, and then it was like kind of playing around with it, and it was like ending up all over the screen. And then another part of it is that you're sending out like text. So I have like a name. My name is KC1GVN. And then you have to include all this information, which was also really interesting. And then that's kind of getting all garbled too. So it could end up kind of all over the image. So it's sort of, actually, as I'm saying to you, I'm like, it's very similar in some ways to like some of the interests that I have in these images in the show as well here in MEM, because it's like an image that I can't create myself. So it's like I was working with, like I had the original image, but then I was much more interested in what happened in that sort of space in between that created something completely new.
Yeah, and a lot of your work involves a lot of experimentation and unknown elements and how it will turn out when it's on view, when it's actually in the gallery. We first started working together on a piece I commissioned from you for the New Harmony Gallery of Contemporary Art in New Harmony, Indiana. I'll let you talk more about that.
Yeah, that was another real experimental of the pandemic. So, it was fantastic to be able to work with you and to go down there. We went on that research trip and we kind of learned, a lot was you and Jim telling me about a lot of things of that place. And then, but the process of actually making that work in the gallery was pretty wild because I could only work at home. It was very much in the pandemic of like I was kind of only in my living room. So I made all these kind of small paintings in my living room, and then we were getting this form fabricated. So it was like I couldn't see any of it together. My house was not tall enough to even simulate it. So it was just showing up at the gallery with all these small little bits of a painting and then kind of improvising and seeing, is this going to work the way they wanted? And the idea being that there was those big storefront windows, and it was like, how can I use this light to create this image? So it was like a stained glass window where it would project through the storefront, but like in many projects, there's a lot of things that you can't control or know. Well, I can't control or know about light. So that was a really, really fun and stressful moment as well.
And that piece turned out amazing.
Thank you.
I loved visiting the gallery at different times of the day to see the piece, move with the light in the gallery. I loved coming all times of the day. The other thing about that piece and around this time is when you started to delve more into Jewish mysticism and research centered around your identity, correct?
Yeah, so, again, in some ways it was a COVID hobby where that was something that, I was at home trying, I had just moved back to this country, trying to kind of think through my experiences of having living abroad, living in Qatar, kind of working with my students over there on their identity. And then I was coming back and kind of thinking through, okay, well, so what's my identity and what's my cultural heritage that I can continue to investigate more. So I took a lot of online classes at that time in protective magic and mysticism. It was also something that, was really something that you do when you're a little bit older. Like you're supposed to sort of study this around 40. And that's, as I was kind of moving toward that, it felt like also this was this new information that was open to me. So that was mostly what I was doing in COVID, was taking these online classes, kind of learning, thinking through these, looking at different symbols, kind of trying to understand what is also the visual images that can relate to Judaism, because I had spent so much time in Qatar looking at different kind of images that relate to Islamic motifs. And I wanted to kind of see, okay, what do we have? What do I have in this culture as well?
Yeah. And you did notice some overlap in symbols, and which is interesting, and I don't think everybody realizes. Do you want to talk about, maybe give an example of maybe?
Yeah, I mean, it was part of what made my life in Qatar so rich and interesting for me, was like getting to understand this other culture, but also the relationship between my own culture. So, there's a lot of shared symbols. The most known is the Hamsa, which is both the hand of Miriam and the hand of Fatima. And it has really an overlap. That was also something in these classes. There's a lot of overlap to these ideas of what is protective magic, or like knowledge of plants. They're really, we're talking about a similar region and a lot of shared information. So as you're kind of delving into this, it's not so much only about Judaism in any way. It's really about like what was happening at that time, who was there, and what kind of information did they share, and what kind of communities were they building.
Yeah, it's about attachment to place in a lot of ways. And moving from Qatar, from the Middle East to the Midwest is a huge undertaking and difficult during the pandemic. What was this? How did that go for you in art making? Are you usually collaborative or in your art making, or is and so how was that for you?
Yeah, I have had the experience of moving quite a bit. I also lived in Denmark for a while. I've lived in many different cities in the U.S. So everywhere that I've moved, I've kind of looked for like who's here, who can I collaborate with, who's making interesting work that can also inspire me and that I can help create something with them too. So I think that is to say that then it was pretty challenging that when I arrived here very soon after was the pandemic. And that was like really a kind of a closing in period. I think that's what made it was a pretty difficult transition. Also going from living in such a large city to living in a small city. I was originally living in Muncie. There was a lot of cultural things to relearn, and just like, it was a very different place. So I think I like to appreciate what is unique about everywhere. And I felt like I have learned through living here so much about this place as well. And I found so much that inspires me about living here too. And so it's not that, I wouldn't say that it's negatively impacted me by any means. Like I really am grateful for every place that I've lived and every person that I've interacted with and how they have contributed to my work.
And when you're like, so let's go back to making the commission piece for New Harmony. I think we named it together A Perfect Mind.
Yeah.
And those, talk about like some of the stories in that piece, and then where you went from there in your research and your art making from that piece.
Yeah, so at that time we were talking about the Minerva Society, and the relationship to New Harmony. So it was, that sort of got me thinking about like women and different stories about women. So that piece that I made was really reflective of like women from the Torah that are interesting to me. There was there were 3 different panels of this stained glass, kind of deconstructed stained glass window. And one of them was devoted to Miriam. And it was kind of telling the whole story of Miriam's life, also from saving Moses through sort of the dancing with women in the desert. And there were also another one that was about like water, about swimming in water. So in some ways, I kind of feel like it was like a proto work for what I'm doing now. There's a lot of the same motifs. Some even, it was possible to use a few of the same drawings. But as I was working, I was like, okay, here is the same language that I've been building through these other projects, but the form ended up being very, very different in this work.
And then from there, now, did you start learning about amulet making after that, I think, or?
Yeah, it was part of these classes that I was taking over COVID. But another thing that I think really influenced that research was I've been really interested in casting metal as well. So I had some opportunity to do that. I mean, I had done a little bit in Doha, but I had more opportunity when I was at the residency at Acre in Wisconsin. And at that time I was like, okay, this is a moment where I can like actually try to cast some of these amulets. That's when I was looking at these kind of demons and chains that are from these incantation bowls. And I think that from there, I've just continued to grow that interest in metals. So like that was in we were working in large metals like in aluminum, and then I've gotten more interested in casting smaller things, in traditional ways too. That was something that I also had learned in Qatar, was like working with cuttlefish and sort of this really traditional way of casting. And I found it to be a really... they're very different forms, different ways of working with the same images, but that's been a really fun way for me to kind of explore those symbols.
And we do, it is kind of a little secret piece in the exhibit that we have up right now. So...
yeah, see if you can find them. No, there's
but don't touch them.
yeah, please. But it is, so with these incantation bowls that I was mentioning, it's a very, very old form of protection. And the idea was to have these unfired clay bowls that are buried in each corner. So, and they have on them images of demons and chains to kind of keep that evil energy chained up.
And then the title of the exhibit, Mem, will you talk more about the meaning of that? And, you did say earlier, you turned 40 during your time here and how that's tied into all that.
Yes, so Mem means the number 40. It's a letter. But as I was kind of thinking about this, we were talking about Miriam's well, Miriam, those are all related to this letter. But as I was this is also from a class that I took about the sort of magic of Hebrew letters. And then as I was kind of working through what could this title be that is more expansive than just talking about Miriam, because it's really not ultimately for me about Miriam. But the letter Mem also stands for ideas of water and also for transition. And I think that's been really important to me as I sort of talk about, what it's been like for me to move from Doha to the Midwest and kind of think about okay, well, what do I want to do now that we're all coming out of this pandemic? I'm sort of thinking about what are the next things I want to do. So it also relates in that 40 is sort of the idea of, as I said, the age when you can study this, but also it relates to wandering in the desert, and it relates to the ideas of birth and gestation, which I think, we've talked about that a lot together, but it's really about this creative process for me too, of kind of working through this long idea. Like we said, we've been talking about this for 5 years, and then to kind of finally get to this conclusion in the gallery, or maybe not a conclusion, but a stop on the way of this project.
Yeah, there's, I remember, it took the lighting of this piece. Let's describe what people will see for the listeners, because the lighting, it took a while.
Yeah. So, I mean, within this show, there are some works on paper. There are 18 paper amulets. But in terms of the sculpture, when you encounter this sculpture, there is a large, over life-size woman that is representing Miriam inside an archway with tiered, how would you describe that? Wooden structure, a tiered wooden structure with paintings on top. And then within the bottom of that, there's a rotating disco ball light situation that is splashing all of these different images around.
And it's like a kaleidoscope.
Yes.
It's like walking inside a kaleidoscope.
Yeah. So there's
the divine feminine.
Exactly. I mean, it was like, as I was working on it, especially as I was working it over at Listen Here, I started to realize that because everything was so high, it's a very vertical piece, that suddenly that put us underwater, which I really loved, because the idea was that we started out thinking about the idea of a fountain, but then as I was lighting it and kind of seeing how all the light was going up and thinking about how you light a fountain, then suddenly the viewer is inside this fountain, inside the water. And I started to think about, okay, well, how would that feel? What would that look like? You'd have all these things kind of swimming around, and kind of there'd be a lot of movement inside there, and I wanted there to be a lot of color and movement inside. So because there's like multiple different things spinning. I mean, there's the platform, but it still like kind of casts all these different kind of speeds somehow. That makes it really feel like it's a kaleidoscope.
Yeah. And I don't know if I'm sure this is connected, but because we're talking about being, having the viewer feel like they're also in the water. The bathing, you also went through a ritual bathing. Did that influence this piece at all?
Yes. Sorry.
Do you feel like sharing about that?
Sure. I mean, also that is another part of like Mem can also talk about the mikvah, which is something that is a Jewish ritual bath, but I have always really loved bathing culture. So I was really particularly interested in coming back to kind of experience, okay, what is this Jewish bathing ritual? And it's something that has been, it can be very traditional, but it can also be a very, you can take it how you want, or I will take it how I want. And so I did get to go to a mikvah in Indianapolis for the first time. And in that experience, I truly heard, like, you basically, to describe that, it's like you go into a pool. It has to be a natural spring. So there has to be like a natural water in it. And the experience of that is that you walk into the pool, but there needs to be somebody that is watching you. That's kind of like the witness. And they're there to ensure that you go all the way under the water. So every single part of you. So actually, even before that, you have to be like fully clean, like so clean. So there's an entire ritual of bathing before you go to the ritual bathing. So you're very, very clean, and then you walk into this pool, and somebody's like watching to ensure that every bit, even like all the little hairs on the top of your head, have to go under the water. So you have to do that. You say a prayer, you dunk, they shout from above that it's kosher. And then you do that. And then on the third time after that, you can just be alone in the pool. And then, when I was alone in the pool, it was also, a moment in which it sounds overdramatic to be like, I heard the voice of God. I didn't, but I did have this experience in which I sort of had this feeling like, it was like a reminder that people needed me to do what I was doing. I mean, it sounds like cheesy, but it actually was like a very soothing feeling, especially in like such a turbulent time, to be like, okay, no, like, this is the right thing to be doing at this time. And so I've kind of, when I think about other kind of bathing experiences, another one that I think has really been important to me was at Acre. They have this cold spring, and that was also a place that like, people were gathering, and it was a natural body of water. But it's like when you're in these spaces, you just feel really connected to the water and then to the past, to your ancestors. That's like all part of it. I mean, it's also this feeling, part of the idea of the mikveh is that it's like this womb-like space that's in between life and death. I also really like that idea, that you're kind of floating in this like in-between, which I think was also really important to this idea of this piece, that it's like this sort of, you're in a liminal space, you're in this transition space. That's like all within this one idea.
Yeah. And with Miriam, you know, just thinking about, you and I have talked about like this, thinking about the divine feminine, and particularly you have always made this connection with water. I think within your work and even with the sauna piece that I loved so much that you did in China, which was when we had talked about trying to turn the video room into the sauna. Which did not happen. There is no sauna at Tube currently. Unfortunately, we did not pull that off. But there is a great film by Karen Sider called Ocean.
So good. I mean, that sauna in China, I will also say, has a lot of relationship to this work for me. It was also sort of a proto version of it, even though it looks nothing like this. Like at the sauna that we're talking about was in China, and it was built as a cart, and then it was like in a space, in like a construction site, so that you could kind of envelop yourself in this green tea fog. But part of that too is that actually what they had asked me to make was a project that considered water in the city. Mm-hmm. And I was like, I don't know how to relate to this, because I'd made so much like kind of personal narrative work. And so I started thinking more about like, okay, well, what about the water that's within ourselves and the sort of personal water cycles? And I think that is also part of like my interest in Miriam and this sort of sharing. Like one of the things that really stood out to me from these classes, these magic classes, was this idea that like on Saturday night, all of the water in the world is connected to Miriam. Mm-hmm. And so that was something that I was thinking about. It's like, okay, if all the water in the world is connected to Miriam as well, all of us are connected together in this moment of Saturday night, because we're all, the water is always flowing through all of us.
Yeah. That's amazing. That's beautiful. Yeah. I mean, and we are like, what, I think 90% water. And the one thing that I think we were talking about that I was like, we need to add a rock. Because of course I'm like, I'm new to this, this story and the myth of the mythology of Miriam. And I'm like, we need a rock. And we do have a rock.
Yes. I mean, and I have two major ideas for that. I mean, one is that like the idea of this rock, it was interesting because I really didn't know that as part of this mythology. Like I somehow had missed that. I mean, even I was talking about it with my mother, and she wasn't really that aware of it. Mm-hmm. But I loved that you had brought that, and then that was like some new information to kind of work with, and I think that that's sort of ultimately when I think about this project. I mean, there was so much, like I love all those collaborative moments. I mean, I just got so excited also about that rock and, how are we going to represent that? And there's just a lot of working together that has created new ideas for me. That was like the most remarkable part about it. Even like also the moment when we talked about the amulets. I mean, it was like, also it's like at the end and you're like playing. That's some really important part. I mean, that's kind of goes back to that idea also in New Harmony of like playing with like, you came to the gallery with this vocabulary, but now what can we do with that? Yeah. Kind of just have fun with it.
And the other piece that you had to wear a wrist guard by the end of making were the paper cuts. Tell us about the history of those and those works that you have in the space.
Yeah, so I mean, I always was sort of aware of that as an art form. Like I have, you would use it traditionally. Like when I got married, I had like a ketubah is the name of the wedding contract. And that had a paper cut motif on it. So like I was always kind of aware of it. But I think again, in these magic classes, there was much more, that was when I was really like understanding what these were. And what I loved about them is they're like, they're just made out of paper cut with an X-Acto blade. So it's very simple materials. It's something that's made so that people can take it with them. I think is really important, thinking about like living in the diaspora, but also like moving around the world and I've spent a lot of time moving around the world and like I've lost a lot of things. And so it's nice to imagine these kind of things that you can take with you. And another thing that I really loved about them was that one of the sort of elements was this idea of like having a level of abstraction. So like you're drawing it, you're like cutting it. They're papers that I would fold in half or sometimes into 4 and then cut into, and then you kind of open it up like a really elaborate snowflake. And that was exciting to kind of see a level of abstraction away from like my original drawing, which was a part of like the language that they were working with too, because it was kind of forbidden to really show, people or animals in some ways, but then you could have this kind of abstraction from it through the form of the paper cutting, which actually is very similar to what was happening with the laser cutter. So as I was kind of working and learning about these paper amulets, I realized how similar what I was doing in the large sculpture was. It was kind of like a 3-dimensional amulet. So it suddenly made a lot more sense for me, these like 2D and 3D versions of it. Although it was really important to me when I was making the paper ones that it had to be by hand. Like there's a lot of like imbuing yourself and your intention as you're working. So that's why the wrist guard, like it was really important. I tried to see like, how did I feel if it was cut on a laser cutter, and just to have the same magic. Mm-hmm. It needed to be by hand.
Yeah. And there, there were some pieces you made that we didn't end up using in the show, because there was a lot of experimentation with this, and you were very prolific.
But it's, that's like, again, that's like the fun and the joy, mm-hmm. Is like showing up with all this stuff and then seeing, okay, what actually fits? What do we need to be there? Like, we made, I'd made these kind of really larger versions so that I thought they might function like a screen. But again, a lot of this was like me speculating on how the light was going to work or what was going to happen. And I think when we were actually looking at it, it felt like, I felt like it was like floofy, like it was like extra. Mm-hmm. And so it was like, okay, well, those don't need to be there. And it's like, that's also part of just like the taking out of things and like kind of paring it down is important part of it.
Yeah. Because there was that whole conversation where we had, you made really large scale paper cuts that we had talked about hanging. And eventually we were like, no, it's the light and the shadows and the light playing onto the wall and, projecting through the paintings and creating those images was enough,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Because it became like it was interrupting it too much in a different way, but I think, at some point it was like, okay, well, maybe that's not what's needed. Maybe like more lights are needed. Like, I don't know if you were even there, but in the last second I was like, like waiting for this one box to come from Amazon. And I was like, we need this. I need this. And like added, a third more lights on the last night of the install.
Yeah.
And I'm glad I did it because I feel like, at some point with every project, it's like, okay, you got to cut me off because I'll like keep adding it, keep remixing the whole thing.
You know what? I'm glad I didn't cut you off there with the lights because I came in the next day and it looked just as it does and better. So thank you. Thank you for pulling that last bit, pulling in that last bit of obsession for this, which sure. I'm very pro-obsession. When I say an artist's obsessed, I don't mean it negatively.
Yep.
It's what I admire.
Great. So thank you.
Can you describe for our listeners like what some of the, maybe like one of the we already talked about how there's a hamsa in that, but one of the other less traditional paper cut pieces that you have in the exhibit.
I'm trying to think of one to describe. I mean, I think, some of them, a lot of them are using some of those symbols. You might find them like a pomegranate or garlic. Those are sort of the symbols, but most of the drawings have to do with like ideas of women and connection. So those aren't traditional forms that you would see in these kind of amulets. But I was thinking about, like, what do I need? Like, what is the magic I need? And it's like community. It's, a lot of times it's like a feminine energy. I mean, that's been a real, as I navigate the world, that's something I come to appreciate more and more, so those are the things like I want to see in the world. And that's the magic that I want to put out there.
And you have succeeded. I feel it whenever I come into work every day and step inside MIM. So, what's next for you? Are you just like, whew, and taking a breath, or are you already thinking about what you want to bring into the world next? Because the other thing you and I talked about was this is a birthing process too.
Yeah. I mean, I think it was a lot. I mean, this was a lot to bring this all forward. I think that there are things, I'm always looking at it. I'm like, okay, how can I work on these kind of painting machines? That's kind of how I come to think of it, of like, it's creating these, like I said, images that I couldn't create myself, that are created through these like overlapping lights. That's always something that I'm trying to like perfect more, like part of that kind of working so organically is that then you look at it and you're like, well, okay, what could I do if I could have full control over this room light? Like if it was really totally dark, or now that we learned how to make this spinning disc, what's the next thing I can do? So like on one level, I have sort of ideas like that. And then I feel like I could have kept making millions more of these paper cut amulets. Like I have more ideas and like more images. Like that was something that I haven't worked with so much, is like the idea of like an image that's like a static image. And that was actually really exciting for me to work with.
And is there anything I haven't asked you about with this exhibit that you want to talk about, or your work?
I think, I had this moment, well, there were several feelings I had when we actually were looking at this together. It was a very spiritual moment to kind of finally see Miriam in the well, and like surrounded by that light. I guess we didn't really talk about like light in Judaism and like how important that is. And, thinking through like ideas of like stained glass windows. Like Chagall's windows have always been really captivating, but the sort of spirituality of light and color, and again, like kind of how that functions rather than trying to make a painting of that, that sort of that change. Like I've also been really excited about like, I've been in the gallery during the day and then at night, and that kind of slight shift is really exciting to me. The other thing that, as I was looking at this when it was finally set up, was I had this really amazing experience that relates to the content so much for me, of kind of seeing in this work all of the people and places that have influenced me. And that was, I've been kind of building this language over a period of time, but a lot of people have helped me to do that. So, going from, studying painting in like a really kind of well, RISD wasn't very traditional, but I did learn to paint on canvas. Like I studied color theory, all those things. And then kind of the evolution of like moving from paint to light, but also, in this sort of trajectory of moving around the world, it's like I've worked a lot with performance artists, with social practice, and with fabrication. And that's been like a huge change, is kind of like what happens when I'm using new tools and kind of working with the same language in different ways, and how that's influenced by the people that are around me. So in this project, working more with metal, that's something that was like new. Also working with fabrication, like the laser cutter, all of those things are kind of like an evolution. I had worked with that before, but I'm saying like in terms of going from sort of traditional painting through this, but it's like it's influenced by people that are around me. And I think that was like, it was just like kind of looking at this sort of mirage of all of that. Like it was like a simultaneous, like everything happening all at once and seeing all those people. And that was like, I guess, a spiritual moment for me too.
It's an amazing piece, and I'm really, of course I didn't make it, but I'm really proud to host this exhibit.
Yeah,
So.
I mean, it's just been an amazing experience working together. I mean, I know I've said this, I'm going to say it on the radio, like I wouldn't have made this without you.
Oh,
it's just, it really feels like this experience of like working. I mean, you don't often get to work with someone that understands your work so much, but also has brought so much of your own vision that I feel like this is this kind of baby together.
It's our baby.
This is our baby.
We made this baby. But you did all the work. You were definitely the mother vessel of...
I mean, that happens with babies.
Yes. Thank you for being the mother of men. What are some of the, I'm always curious what artists are reading what are you reading now? What would you just say, hey, you should read this or watch? It can be film, it can be book. What do you recommend?
Oh my gosh.
What are you excited about?
It's like, of course, when you ask this kind of question, every like title goes out of my brain.
I should have forewarned you because it's actually like everybody I ask this, they're like, oh, I need to Google.
I know, we can't remember anything anymore.
No, I can't either. No, no.
I mean, because I'm like thinking through all these like the kind of poems and readings from these classes. I mean, of course, I'm like also there's a lot of influence of just like things that are happening right in this moment. Like there is one of the paper amulets that relates a lot to me to the current, like the new Wim Wenders movie, Perfect Days. That was something where I really found a lot of connection in the moment, thinking about light and shadow and sort of, I don't know, a lonely life and like what that could mean or what that does mean. Yeah, I'd have to give you a reading list. I'm like, oh, I'm not. I mean,
okay, listeners, you can look for that online, the reading list.
Well, I mean, the thing is, like, you mentioned this about, like, an obsessive working style. But the truth is, like, while I've been working, I mean, I have been so deep into working that it's like, I mean, time just passed, That was also the experience, like, when we were actually looking at it in the gallery, and I was like, it just felt like it just appeared, because I've just been so involved in the making. There's so many steps. Like that was also something as I was working, I was like, how many times have I touched this single painting over and over again? And so in that way, it's like I did all this research and I read all these books and I looked at all these images of paper cuts and it just like all was like in my brain. But then when I'm working, it's just me and a blank sheet of paper.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like one thing I'm pretty sure I notice as a curator that I see in artists' work that draw me to certain artists is loss of time. It's I think because like you were saying, you were, when you were making the paper cuts, you were setting intentions, and I admire and love that sense. And it doesn't happen to me as much, I don't think, where you're just so deep into it. It might be morning and you might wake up, or you might fall asleep, or you just the loss of time, the loss of a day, but you have something to show for it.
Yeah. I mean, especially working on the paper cuts, that was really, it's like I would just start and the ideas would just like flow out and I would just be cutting. And then all of a sudden it's like 12 hours later. And that was like, I mean, I worked on those sort of in succession for like a few weeks. And it just was like all I was doing,
It's like how you spent your spring break, right?
Yeah. But it's like, it's such a great joy. Like it was challenging, but also like, I mean, it was so much fun.
Yeah. And with those two, I was going to say that you also painted them, or maybe used watercolor, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, you didn't paint on them, but you use watercolor to color them. They're not just plain. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so and that is in the traditional form. They were colored with watercolors. But that was a really interesting part that, again, kind of related to the same process of okay, I would draw it on the paper, sort of loosely, cut it, and then you would look at this and then kind of try to interpret, where should the color be within this? So it kind of was gave that layer of abstraction. So it was I had sort of the cut version and then this loose painting on top of it that kind of transformed that. And that was a really interesting process of working with those because a lot of times I was very certain, which was surprising to me because I'm not always the most certain, but it's that same kind of looseness that I was working with the laser cut images too. And then there were a few times where I started to get stuck. It was like a puzzle sometimes. And those were interesting moments too. And then also there's a backing to them. So I put colored, basically tissue paper behind them. And then that created an entire other layer of depth, but also some really fascinating color theory problems. So, also I was thinking a lot about my students too, and these kinds of, basic two-dimensional design questions that we're asking them to solve. And that's what was happening here too. It's you have this balance between the color, the positive and negative shape. It was it was really fascinating to kind of think through the process of art and design, and then also these images and these sort of spiritual images. It was all I don't know. I had a lot of time to think.
Yeah. And I think we both thought it was funny. The framer hung one of the pieces upside down, right?
Yeah. Yes.
But we won't say what one. No. But we know that happened, and it's not bad that happened.
No, I loved it. I actually loved that because it felt like another collaboration. But it was, they're symmetrical, so. It's of course, I saw it as one way, but I love that somebody else saw it a different way. It really changed how I understood it. And actually, it really helped to balance them out for me. It made more sense. So I was actually really appreciative of that.
Well, thank you so much, Rachel. For our listeners, we hope you'll come and see her exhibit, MIM. It's up at Tube Factory through June 23rd. And where can our listeners follow your work? Instagram?
Yep. So you can follow me on Instagram. It's Rachel Leah C. Leah, I'll spell it for you. RachelLeahC. And my website is rachelleahcohn.com.
Thanks again. And special thanks to our funders who made this exhibit possible. Alan Whitehill Clues Charitable Foundation, the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts, the Ephraimson Family Fund, Ruth Foundation for the Arts, the Arts Council of Indianapolis, and the City of Indianapolis. Also, the Institute of Museum and Library Services. Thanks again, Rachel.
Thank you.